Hi everyone, this is the video just for setting up your palette for both the master copy painting that you're going to do as well as the limited palette still life that you need to do. So I started with my grayscale palette right here, and what I did is I figured out what things were dry and I just couldn't use, and I start off first with just cleaning off using a palette knife. It's a lot less messy, but the palette knife won't finish cleaning this, so you have to finish cleaning it with your razor blade scraper. So you'll want to refer to the diagram that I made that shows what is in this palette and make sure you set it up just like the diagram. And so what I'm doing right now is I'm scraping most of the dried off paint, and then I'm going to put these piles together to make my grayscale, whatever I've got left here, to make the rest of my grayscale for that first row on that diagram. And some of these I actually just remixed these values so that I would have them for this. So here I start taking the razor blade scraper, and I'm showing you all of this so that you can kind of see how you clean it. You want to put a fresh razor blade in your scraper. It does not come with one loaded, so you've got to put it in. Use a tabletop or something to push it in there, but you can see that the beauty of this thing is that if you have some rags there, you can basically just wipe off all this paint, and it's like your glass is brand new and fresh. You don't need to clean it. Don't wash your palette with anything. It's not necessary, first off, and secondly, if it does anything, it's going to damage the tape or the board that it's on, because those aren't waterproof. So I just go through and I keep cleaning some of this off and get it all ready. And then I start moving my grays over, and what I'm doing is I'm mixing piles together. So to make my level 8 here, which is what's on the diagram, I forgot, let me pull up the diagram. So looking at this diagram right here, to make my level 8 on that, value 8, this top one. So what I did was I mixed together my 9 and my 8 and some of my 7. And then I took the rest of my 7 and mixed it with the 6 to make this 6 right here. Then I think I even grabbed a little bit of this and mixed it with my 5 and a little bit of the 4 to make this 4 pile. And then I took what I had here for the 3, I put that here, but then I added some white to it so I could get a little bit better light gray. It was, or maybe I just even took a little bit of this gray and then added white to it. That might have been what I did. Yeah, because this is me darkening this up just a little bit. It wasn't quite gray enough. It felt more like just still white. And I wanted something that was just barely a light gray. You kind of see as you look at this. Okay, so after you do that, then I come back through. I was kind of resolving some of these values a little bit better. And then I scraped off the rest of my paint. And after I scrape it off, I went back through with the razor blade scraper and just made sure it was really clean one more time before I started. There's all my leftover paint there. It's all drying out. Then I started getting out my other colors that I needed. So this first row is raw umber. Second row is burnt umber. The next row will be Indian red, which is this color. Then burnt sienna, and then yellow ochre. So I got all the paint out and kind of ready. And then I just started squeezing it out on the palette. Really tiny amounts down here at the bottom. Hello, Zero. I went through and put my reds, my burnt sienna, and my yellow. Now let's pause this for just a second and let's look back at the diagram again. Because what you'll notice is that what we're going to do is we're going to put the colors where they belong as far as their value. So this right here basically represents my pure Indian red, and this represents my pure burnt sienna. And because they're more of like dark reds, they're not the same darkness as like black and the two umbers. They're a little bit lighter than that, so I put them in this value 8 row. I put them as being about a value 8. And then you'll notice that the yellow ochre is even lighter than these. And so the yellow ochre has been moved back down to this value 5, 6 row. It's basically value 6 is what it says there. What that means is that I need to make darker versions of these three colors. Okay, when we're making a darker version, we call it a shade. The official definition of that is that any color plus black is a shade, and any color plus white is a tint. Okay, now our difference is that instead of always adding black, we're adding colors that are within the color family. And if you've watched the limited palette lecture where I discuss the color theory that we're looking at a little bit more in depth, this will make more sense to you. Right now, if you've just watched this, you're not going to understand why we're doing this. But basically, ivory black is in the blue family, and it's closest to this purple red family, okay, of Indian red. Burnt umber is in the orange family, and so it's closest to the orange red of burnt sienna. And raw umber is in the green yellow family, and it's probably closest to yellow ochre, because yellow ochre is in the yellow family. Now, I might have been able to do the burnt umber as well. It's about equidistant as far as our color wheel goes, but I chose raw umber just so that I have a little bit different shade here. Otherwise, I end up with two different versions, basically, of burnt umber. So the nice thing is this gives me more of a greenish yellow shade color, and this gives me a little bit more of a reddish brown, and then this gives me kind of a violet red shade color, and then you have these shade colors. So going back, what you're going to see is that I'm adding other colors into these. So I've got Indian red, I've put it down. One thing to know is that Indian red in particular can be a really high pigmenting strength, so you actually need to do a little bit less of it. In fact, you'll notice when I mix these that I ended up having to move the piles up, because even though I made them lighter, it still just wasn't light enough. So you'll notice that that's a bit different sometimes with some pigments, and Indian red is one of those. So if we go back to the video, you can see that I've got all the basic colors laid out. And then what I do is I start grabbing the different shade colors that I need for things and moving them. I was just trying to get things kind of fixed. I had put my shade color there because I wasn't thinking, and it needed to go up there. So now I'm starting to go back in and add my shades here. I added some raw umber. I added burnt umber up here, and I need to add a little bit of ivory black, which I just pulled out of my black pile and added that here. And then I moved a little bit of my red down so that I would have a little bit more black there. Maybe a little too much red, I can't remember. You guys have a good... And then as I go through, and I start adding in the whites to all of these to make my tint piles. And then I start mixing each of the piles. So I did this opposite of what I tell you guys to do, and I'm sorry because I realized it after I got through the first couple rows, but normally what I tell you guys to do is to get your grays there first because you have the most experience with mixing those. And then mix these two rows because they're going to match the closest to what you're doing with this row initially. And then after you've made sure that these all line up correctly, before you start working on putting out paint and mixing these, get these first three rows working correctly and then add these last three rows. Okay, so I just forgot and I laid it all out the way I would if I'm just doing my palette, but for your purposes, that's what I would recommend, is start out with these first three rows. You should have the grays, at least some of the gray left. If not, it should be, mixing it should be fairly simple for you. You want to look for a nice step through these values, and then you're going to want the same thing as you go through. So here I'm just mixing up all my different tints. I make adjustments sometimes, maybe decide as I'm going through that something needs to be a little bit lighter or darker. But when I get to the end of this, what I want is mostly for this row to kind of line up, for this row to line up, for this row to line up, and so on, as far as the values. And they might be a little off here or there, but it makes a big difference when you're painting if these do line up, because if you've learned anything about light, and one of the things you'll learn as you go into color is that it's the value that gives you the sense of whether or not it's in the light or shadow. And shifting color, all it does is shift temperature. So if all these values match all the way across, then if you're painting something like with this orange color and then you decide it needs to be a little bit more of the violet color mixed with the orange, you just grab this pile, and it doesn't change anything as far as what the light and shadow reading is where you're at. Okay, so that's part of the reason we want these to match, so that as you go through and paint, you can start building a little bit more complexity to your color temperatures and understanding how they interact with each other without worrying as much about value, because hopefully you're starting to understand the value already. So I had decided that this was a little bit too dark, and that was me mixing some of it up there to lighten this. And then I added more white into that pile. And I think I pulled a lot of that red out before I mixed it too. Yeah, I did. And then I mixed that one so it was lighter. Because remember, this whole row here should feel like it's just slightly darker than the white. So these are very, very pale tints. I went through and mixed my umber pile finely, burn umber, and then raw umber. Then I went up and started mixing my shades. So I mixed the raw umber in to make like a level 8 basically value of yellow ochre, and then a level 9, 10 value. If it were truly 10, it'd be black, but a level 9 basically value. And so those are my shades of yellow ochre. And then here I'm mixing my shades of first the burnt sienna and then the Indian red. So you do need to really refer to the diagram that shows you how it's laid out, and please follow that very closely as you're setting up your palette and as you're mixing. You want these to match value-wise going across. When you're all done with it, feel free to turn it into a photograph with your camera and then check your value. These, now that we're shifting different saturation levels, it's going to be harder for you to make those judgments. So right here is the palette once I was done. And if we actually look at this, let's go ahead and get rid of all the saturation. And I haven't even checked it yet to see. So you can see it jumps a little bit here. This one needs to be slightly darker to line up, and this probably actually needs to be slightly darker. And then these would all line up basically as far as value, or pretty close, okay? And then this needs to be slightly darker as well, not a lot, and this needs to be slightly darker. So my gray piles and my burnt sienna piles, I needed to make those slightly darker, but if I adjust these to be a little bit darker, these all line up pretty well. This looks okay here, that's pretty close in value, and these look pretty good in value. And that's basically what you want to see when you're all done with it. And turning it to that black and white photograph will help you to see that a little bit better so that you do things correctly.